If you have ever sat down to do something that required real focus and found yourself on your phone 20 minutes later without knowing how you got there, this is not about discipline. Most people who struggle to concentrate are not lazy. They are not poorly motivated. They are not fundamentally different from people who seem to focus easily. What they are is operating in an environment that has been specifically engineered to prevent sustained attention, and doing so with a brain that was not designed for that environment. The inability to concentrate is not a personal failing. It is a mismatch between the biology of attention and the conditions that modern technology has created around it. Understanding that mismatch changes how you approach the problem, because you stop trying to override a biological system through willpower and start changing the conditions the system is operating in. Let's go through what is actually happening. Attention is not a fixed resource that some people have more of than others. It is a biological function governed primarily by the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for directing cognitive resources, suppressing irrelevant information, maintaining goal-directed behavior, and holding task-relevant information in working memory. The prefrontal cortex does not operate in isolation. It works in constant competition with other brain regions, particularly the limbic system, which governs automatic responses, emotional reactions, and reflexive orienting toward novelty and potential reward. The balance between prefrontal control and limbic reactivity determines, in practice, how well a person can sustain focus on a chosen task in the presence of competing stimuli. When the prefrontal cortex is well-resourced, adequate sleep, adequate glucose, low cortisol, it can maintain this competition effectively. Distractions are noticed and suppressed. The mind returns to the task. When the prefrontal cortex is under-resourced, from sleep deprivation, chronic stress, high cortisol, or sustained cognitive load, its ability to suppress the limbic system's reactive responses diminishes. Distractions that would normally be filtered out capture attention. Task switching increases. Sustained focus becomes effortful in a way that does not happen when the system is functioning well. This is why concentration is worse in the afternoon for most people, worse after poor sleep, worse during high-stress periods, and worse when you are trying to focus on something cognitively demanding for an extended period without breaks. None of these are signs of a broken attention system. They are the predictable outputs of a system responding to its conditions. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most directly involved in attention regulation, and understanding its role explains why phones have the specific effect on focus that they do. Dopamine is commonly described as the pleasure neurotransmitter, but this is an oversimplification. Its primary function is not pleasure, it is prediction and motivation. Dopamine is released in anticipation of reward, in response to novel stimuli, and, most importantly for the phone discussion, in response to unpredictable reward. The unpredictability of reward is the critical variable. Research by neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz established that dopamine neurons respond most strongly not to reward itself but to unexpected reward and to cues that predict the possibility of reward. When reward is predictable, dopamine response drops. When reward is unpredictable, sometimes present, sometimes not, on an irregular schedule, the dopamine response remains elevated and the motivation to keep checking remains high. This is the exact mechanism that underlies gambling addiction. Slot machines do not pay out every time. They pay out unpredictably. The unpredictability maintains the dopamine-driven motivation to keep pulling the lever far more effectively than consistent reward would. Every notification, every social media feed, every email inbox operates on the same principle. Sometimes there is something interesting, sometimes there is nothing. You cannot predict which it will be until you check. The unpredictability of the reward maintains the dopamine-driven urge to check. Not because you are weak, but because unpredictable reward is one of the most powerful behavioral drivers in mammalian neuroscience. The phone is a slot machine in your pocket, and you have been pulling the lever dozens of times per day. The attention cost of this pattern goes beyond the time spent on the phone. It involves what researchers call attention residue. When you switch from a task to a phone check and then return to the task, you do not return with full cognitive attention. A portion of your cognitive resources remains allocated to the previous interruption, processing the notification you saw, thinking about the message you received, anticipating whether there will be something new if you check again. This residual allocation persists for longer than most people expect. A study by Sophie Leroy at the University of Washington found that the cognitive cost of task switching persists for an average of 15 to 20 minutes after the switch, meaning that a 30-second phone check at 11 in the morning can impair the quality of work you are doing until 11:20. A separate study at the University of California, Irvine tracked knowledge workers and found that once interrupted, it took an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to return to the original task at the same level of engagement. The interruption itself was brief. The cognitive cost was not. This is why people who check their phone frequently throughout a work session often feel, at the end of the day, that they worked hard but accomplished less than expected. The time and the task was real. The cognitive quality of that time was repeatedly degraded by attention residue from the interruptions. There is a specific neurological reason why the first 20 minutes of deep work are the hardest. When you begin a cognitively demanding task, the prefrontal cortex needs to activate, allocate resources, and establish the neural patterns associated with the specific type of thinking the task requires. This process takes time. In the first several minutes of attempting focused work, the brain is still in a state of relatively low engagement with the task. The neural resources are being assembled rather than deployed. During this window, the task feels difficult in a way that is not representative of how it will feel once engagement is established. The effort required seems high, the reward of progress is not yet present, and the pull of the phone, with its unpredictable dopamine reward, is at maximum comparative attractiveness. Most interruptions and task abandonments happen in this window, not because the work is too hard, but because the brain has not yet transitioned into the state where the work flows. The transition state feels like resistance, but it is actually setup. Once past this window, typically around 15 to 20 minutes of uninterrupted engagement, the prefrontal cortex has allocated its resources, working memory is loaded with the relevant information, and the cognitive state shifts from effortful startup to something more like flow. The work becomes easier. The pull of the phone becomes less compelling. This means that the critical variable for sustained focus is not hour-long blocks of perfect concentration. It is surviving the first 15 to 20 minutes without interruption. That is when the biological setup occurs. That is when most people give in. And protecting that specific window through environmental design rather than willpower is the intervention with the highest leverage on focus quality. Repeated task switching, the pattern of constantly moving between the main task, phone, email, and other interruptions, does not just reduce performance in the moment. Research suggests it produces longer-term changes in how the brain allocates attention. A study by Eyal Ophir at Stanford University compared the attentional control of heavy media multitaskers, people who regularly engaged with multiple media streams simultaneously, with light multitaskers. The heavy multitaskers performed worse on every cognitive measure tested. They were more susceptible to distraction from irrelevant stimuli, less able to suppress irrelevant information from working memory, and slower to switch between tasks when required to do so. The paradox is striking. People who multitask more are worse at multitasking. And more broadly, people who regularly expose their attention to high distraction environments appear to develop less effective attentional control over time. The brain adapts to what it repeatedly does. If attention is repeatedly pulled away before sustained engagement can be established, the neural patterns associated with sustained attention get less reinforcement. The capacity for deep focus is not lost. It is a fundamental capacity of the human brain, but it can become less accessible when it has not been practiced regularly. The good news in this is the same as the bad news. The brain adapts to what it repeatedly does. The capacity for sustained attention can be rebuilt through practice in conditions that support it. Here is what the research supports practically. The most effective intervention for improving focus is environmental rather than volitional, removing the phone from the work environment, not silencing it, not turning it face down, but physically placing it in another room. Has been shown in research to improve cognitive performance even when the phone is turned off. The mere presence of a phone on a desk, even face down and silenced, consumes a portion of cognitive resources because part of the brain monitors it as a potential source of reward and interruption. A 2017 study published in the Journal of the Association for Consumer Research found that participants performed significantly better on cognitive tasks when their phone was in another room compared to on the desk, even when the phone was silent and they had been instructed to ignore it. The phone's presence alone degraded performance. Notification management is more effective than willpower-based resistance to notifications. The dopamine response to unpredictable reward means that knowing a notification might be there is sufficient to divert attention. You do not need to receive a notification to be affected by the possibility of one. Turning off all non-essential notifications eliminates the unpredictable reward signal that drives compulsive checking. The urge to check does not disappear immediately, but without the unpredictable reward reinforcing it, it diminishes over days and weeks. Time blocking, allocating specific periods for deep work during which interruption is structurally prevented, is more effective than attempting sustained focus on an ad hoc basis. The prefrontal cortex manages competing demands better when the rules are clear. Knowing that the next 90 minutes are designated for deep work, after which checking will occur, removes the ongoing cognitive load of managing whether or not to check. The decision has already been made. The transition period, the first 15 to 20 minutes, can be made more navigable by starting with a brief, specific ritual that signals the beginning of the focus period. This is not superstition. Rituals and environmental cues become associated with specific mental states through conditioning, and a consistent pre-focus routine activates the associated neural patterns more quickly than simply sitting down and trying to start. The brain recognizes the cue and begins the transition faster. And sleep, again, is not separable from this. Prefrontal cortex function is among the first casualties of sleep deprivation. A person attempting deep focus on inadequate sleep is doing so with structurally reduced capacity in the exact brain region that focus depends on. Addressing sleep quality addresses the biological substrate of attention, and no amount of environmental optimization fully compensates for an under-resourced prefrontal cortex. Here is the framing that changes how most people think about this. The inability to focus is not a character trait. It is not evidence of weakness, laziness, or a fundamentally distractible mind. It is the output of a biological attention system operating in an environment that was designed by some of the most sophisticated behavioral engineering in human history, specifically to capture and hold attention against the user's own interests. Social media platforms, notification systems, and content feeds employ teams of engineers and behavioral scientists whose explicit goal is to maximize the time you spend engaged with their product. The slot machine mechanism, unpredictable reward on a variable schedule, is not an accident of design. It is the intended design, optimized through decades of A/B testing against human behavior. Expecting willpower to overcome this consistently is like expecting someone to consistently resist a slot machine through sheer determination. The mechanism is too well matched to the biology. The leverage point is not trying harder. The leverage point is changing the environment. Remove the phone from the room. Turn off notifications. Protect the first 20 minutes of focus sessions as the highest priority window. Give the prefrontal cortex the conditions it needs to function: adequate sleep, managed stress, consistent practice of sustained attention in low distraction environments. The capacity for deep focus is not gone. It is available. It just needs conditions that allow it to operate. If this gave you a different way of thinking about why focus has become harder, hit the like button. Share it with someone who has been blaming themselves for not being able to concentrate. And subscribe for more content like this.